Okay, so this webinar is part of our Epoch Practice series of webinars. It's webinar number 5 of the series. There will be another 7 next year. So just for you to keep up to date with our continuing webinar series, you can find us on our website and on X and LinkedIn. So we have lots of interesting content, including this webinar on decriminalization upcoming. Epoch Practice is a project co-funded by the European Commission, focused on mutual learning and capacity building within the European Platform on Combating Homelessness. So we share a lot of innovative practices in the field of homelessness. We have discussions like this one on very important issues like decriminalization of homelessness. And we have a lot of activities coming up in 2025. So I know we have a really interesting speaker coming up, so I'm gonna let us get ahead with that. This webinar is also organized in coordination with Housing Rights Watch, which is a platform coordinated also with FEANTSA. I'm going to hand over the floor to my colleague María José Aldanas from Housing Rights Watch to say a few words.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Sasha. I'm just going to take 5 minutes to introduce, set the scene for Europe while we wait for Mr. Rajagopal to join us. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As Sasha says, I'm María Aldanas. I'm policy officer at FEANTSA, and I coordinate Housing Rights Watch. It is a privilege to open this discussion on such an urgent issue. Today, we're diving into the topic of decriminalization of homelessness, a challenge affecting communities across Europe and beyond. We are especially honored to have the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to advocate housing with us. His insights couldn't be more timely as we work to shift from punitive approaches to those centered on rights and dignity. So let's start with a quick look at where we are in Europe. Homelessness has reached unprecedented levels across the continent, with an estimation of over 1 million people experiencing homelessness every night. And more people are forced to adopt survival strategies such as sleeping rough, begging, or squatting just to get by. Tragically, these actions result too often in displacement, in fines, unjust arrests, and other forms of punishment rather than support. For us, it is a paradox that people who are already vulnerable are seen as public nuisances or even criminals rather than as people who need help. At European level, we are seeing important initiatives to address these challenges, like the European Platform on Combating Homelessness. They are working to support national efforts to tackle homelessness. And personally, I would like to see the platform adopt a human rights-based approach and perhaps work towards the decriminalization of homelessness. Rather than mentioning all the decriminalization efforts at national or local level, I would like to focus on the use of litigation through European human rights instruments. First of all, I would like to take a look at 2 cases that illustrate the contradictions of the recent European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence. You may all know them. One of them is Lakatos versus Switzerland. In this case, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in favor of a Romanian woman fined and imprisoned for begging. The court found that this punishment violated her rights to private and family life, recognizing begging as a means of survival and underscoring the importance of preserving human dignity. This decision served as a strong precedent for treating homelessness with compassion rather than criminalization. But unfortunately, there's a more recent case, Diane versus Denmark. The European Court upheld a 20-day prison sentence for a Romanian convicted just for begging. This aligns with Danish law, and the court ruled that the punishment did not violate the European Convention. This decision is a setback for human rights and underlines the limitations of the protections of the European Convention. For us in FEANTSA, collective complaints before the European Committee of Social Rights are a vital tool to address violations of economic and social rights. And I would like to mention 2 recent complaints to illustrate this. One of them is the FEANTSA and FIDH versus France complaint, registered in April 2023 last year. We were concerned about the increasing number of municipal orders in France that seek to punish the behavior of homeless people in public spaces. And these, combined with a lack of regulatory limits on municipal orders, was failing to safeguard their fundamental rights. So we were clear in our allegation that France's legal framework was inadequate in protecting against discrimination and criminalization under the European Social Charter. The second case, very similar, is FIDH and ATD Fourth World versus Belgium, a complaint registered in December 2023. These organizations highlighted the increasing number of municipal regulations in Belgium, prohibiting or restricting begging, measures that were disproportionately affecting vulnerable communities, especially the Roma. This complaint stressed the need for constitutional protections to protect vulnerable populations, pushing for a more humane and coordinated approach to individuals facing extreme poverty. So these two collective complaints are still pending, but for us, they represent a crucial opportunity to push for systemic change through the European Social Charter, challenging unjust practices and advocating for comprehensive social protections. Moving forward, our work requires continued efforts, both in the courts and on the ground, to ensure that homelessness is no longer criminalized, but recognized as a societal issue that must and can be solved. Today's discussion is an opportunity to reflect on the next steps to protect the fundamental rights of homeless individuals. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the UN Special Rapporteur, Professor Rajagopal, who will provide a global perspective on this issue. Thank you all, and I look forward to a productive discussion today.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me well. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to join this meeting, and my greetings to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time zone that you're in. This is a very important topic, and I'm really glad that this meeting is organized. And as was mentioned, it cannot come at a more timely manner, both in Europe, but also in the United States. The issue of homelessness and how to deal with homelessness is, especially because it is connected with the broader issue of the affordable housing crisis, emerged as a major domestic issue in one country after another. And elections are often fought, won or lost based on the housing issue in these countries now. So it's very important that we really remobilize and re-engage on these issues. So as far as my remarks are concerned, I thought what I will do is to sort of make some broad remarks about homelessness in general, the alarming trends in terms of homelessness, and then say a few words about the criminalization of homelessness and some efforts that we have undertaken, including, of course, the joint report that we issued in June, myself and the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights on extreme poverty, Olivier de Schutter, and some other efforts we have taken, including an amicus curiae petition that we filed at the US Supreme Court. And then kind of wrap up at that point. First of all, it's clear that homelessness is increasingly the condition that too many people are facing. I just returned from the World Urban Forum in Cairo, organized by UN Habitat, and they had a whole track called The Loss of Home. Yes, there is indeed a loss of home or homelessness. And this loss of home or homelessness is felt by too many around the world as a result of what you can only call as polycrisis, an intersection of multiple crises, from military, security, geopolitical, economic, ecological, and a social crisis, which are not new but have festered over many years and have unfortunately coincided over the last few years to produce this perfect storm of increasing housing prices and more people losing their homes, and an increasing demonization and criminalization of people who lose their homes. Homelessness results from a variety of reasons. Of course, it results from people who cannot afford their homes, or who have individual or other reasons to lose their homes because of circumstances beyond their control. Homelessness also results from crises, including disasters or climate change, or in the context of conflict, because of armed conflict and increasing refugee flows. They all result in loss of home. But homelessness is a problem which still remains within the power of at least the most wealthy countries to solve. While there is a lack of reliable worldwide statistics, and this is another problem, that we don't have good data, including reliable data that is consistent across countries, and no UN agency undertakes this task at this point, including UN Habitat. Homelessness definition itself is, of course, very varied all across different countries, as you know. And FEANTSA's own definition, for example, is so different from the definition adopted here in the US, where I am. But in terms of the approaches to data collection, there is really no single agency that most countries designate for dealing with tracking of homelessness, including, most crucially, disaggregated data on the most vulnerable groups exposed to homelessness. But it is very obvious that even with all of these caveats, homelessness is an increasingly major crisis in all world regions. So, for example, in the United States, according to latest official figures, where, as I said, the definition of homelessness is not the one that FEANTSA follows. So we can assume that the numbers are actually probably an undercount. But even with those numbers, over 653,000 people were considered homeless as of 2023, which is a 12% increase over 2022. And given all the impacts that, for example, the recent storm on the East Coast, the hurricanes that devastated the Carolinas and resulted in massive number of people's homes being destroyed, the numbers are going to be worse probably for 2024. It should be noted that in the United States, over 40% of the homeless persons are people of African descent, who make up only 12% of the population, which is itself a form of racial segregation and racial sort of targeting in the homeless population, which I and other rapporteurs have repeatedly condemned. In the EU countries, of course, homelessness has significantly increased since 2010 by at least 70%. The overview on housing exclusion in Europe, published in 2023 September, that you're well aware of, estimates that 895,000 people, at least 895,000 persons, live in Europe, either in street situation, in emergency accommodation, or in accommodation for the homeless. Of course, in the global south, homelessness is a more difficult thing to monitor because it is often not surveyed, or the issue is named differently. But there are far too many people that are living in extreme situations of housing deprivation, including, of course, street homelessness, but also in shanties and other poorly built informal settlements, often without access to any essentials, including safe water and sanitation or electricity, and especially in constant fear of forced evictions. So they are no different from people who are living on the streets, who are always told by the police that they should move on, for example. Then there are many, of course, who live in unauthorized or other camps, including refugees and IDPs as well. So ending homelessness, in that sense, I would say, is one of our greatest global challenges at this stage, which is very complex because it is connected with the broader issue of ensuring affordable housing. But let's be very clear about this. The commitment to ensuring affordable housing and ending homelessness are firmly embedded in a global consensus, including in the Sustainable Development Goals endorsed by the all countries. Of course, it's also a human rights imperative, which means that states must recognize homelessness as a violation of human rights and dignity. Now, homelessness is not only a serious concern because it violates, of course, by definition, it's a violation of the right to adequate housing, but it is also a violation of so many other rights. For example, if we look at morbidity and mortality rates of persons in terms of health impacts, persons in situations of homelessness, when we compare it to people who are adequately housed, the difference is quite shocking. The median age of death for persons in street situation has, in some industrialized countries, been estimated to be 49 years, over 25 years lower than that for the overall population. Then there is the issue of lack of access to water and sanitation, to privacy, to jobs, to even to the right to life, which is more than, of course, mere survival under international law. When we say there is a right to life, we don't mean simply biological survival, but includes as well the notion of a life with dignity. Now, there are multiple reasons why homelessness happens. As I said, it can also happen because of disasters and conflict and such other large factors. But essentially, the sense that we have, certainly I have gathered as a UN rapporteur, is that there is a failure by public authorities to prevent and address homelessness. Particularly, I would emphasize there is very little attention given to the issue of prevention of homelessness. And then when homeless populations increase, there is hand-wringing that goes on among states about, oh, how do we deal with this homelessness population? And then it becomes a political issue in which all kinds of radical and unworkable and inhumane solutions are offered. For example, in the United States, to quote unquote resolve the problem of homelessness, the party that has won power right now, the leading candidate proposed the building of almost concentration camps to remove all homeless populations outside of cities in on the West Coast, including in states like California, for example. But one thing is obvious that there is a duty to prevent homelessness on the part of states in terms of international human rights law. But if homelessness does happen, there is also a duty to address homelessness in a way that is consistent with international human rights. And the failure by states to deal with either of these two duties is a state failure to uphold the most essential elements of the human right to adequate housing and other fundamental rights that everyone should enjoy without discrimination. So the pathways to homelessness are many, and I think that many of you are quite aware of it. But it is possible to anticipate, prevent, reduce, and end it, or at least reduce it to marginal numbers, particularly for countries that have adequate, significant, adequate financial or other resources and have functioning public administration. I mean, recently we saw, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, that there were many measures that were put in place that actually sought to sort of take care of or eliminate completely people living in street homelessness situations. So it is quite possible to resolve these things if there is a political will. Now, in terms of what can be done to deal with homelessness, we've seen many positive examples. I won't mention many, but as just to mention one prominent example, Finland, as you know, has shown that reducing homelessness is possible by adopting a housing-led approach, providing affordable housing, and if necessary, additional ambulance social support, which is extremely critical. So in 1987, over 17,000 people were counted in Finland as homeless, but the latest official figures from 2022 indicate 3,686 persons in various forms of homelessness, a reduction by 83%. So one thing is quite obvious that homelessness results, at least the everyday forms of homelessness, results from the lack of affordable housing and the accumulated result of wrong-headed housing policies that countries have adopted over the years. An over-reliance on the market, a celebration of housing as a commodity, a lack of control over land prices. Land prices are extremely important. One thing is quite obvious to me that it's not possible to ensure affordable housing in countries around the world unless countries have more control over the price of land, because the cost of land actually contributes to almost 70% of the cost of housing in many countries. But if that is the case, if we have a situation where most of the land is actually in the private market, for example, I visited San Diego in California in this recent January of 2024. And what I found there was quite shocking that over 80% of the land is zoned for single family use in San Diego, meaning that it is basically in the private market. When we have a situation like that, it's very hard to actually ensure affordable housing. So is it a surprise that San Diego and West Coast cities actually face a massive homelessness situation? So financialization of housing is a major issue, which has been noted and criticized by my predecessors, and also acknowledged as a major issue even by the UN Human Rights Council. Financialization has transformed housing, of course, from a fundamental human right into an investment tool, stripping it of its essential or intrinsic function to provide secure and dignified living spaces. So we have investors who are interested only in flipping, and big Wall Street firms have entered the picture, who view housing purely as a commodity. Now, this is surely a major issue, but I just want to say that while this is a major issue, we should never forget that the root of it are state policies, including the failure by the states concerned to control land prices, to actually enable the policy framework that allows the entry of these big private investment firms to enter the housing market. In other words, financialization is not happening because it is something that is driven only by private actors. It's happening as a result of government policy, and governments have to be held accountable for that. So with that, let me briefly turn to the issue before us, which is criminalization. Now, if so many people are becoming homeless now because of the multiple or poly crisis that we are facing, and when we are faced with the grave affordable housing crisis, does it really make sense to actually approach the issue of homelessness by subjecting homeless people to criminal penalties? Yet increasingly, that's what we are seeing around the world and have been seeing for many years. And this tendency shows no sign of disappearing. While there are some very important legal transformations that do push in the opposite direction, many countries are still approaching homelessness as an issue that can be simply dealt with by criminalizing it. But homelessness cannot be made to disappear by criminalizing it. It's not going to go away. So that's the reason why the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights and myself, we call for inputs into a report to address the issue of criminalization of homelessness, and to point to all the downsides of that approach, and to suggest better approaches to ending criminalization of homelessness. So just to say that criminalization has a very long history. In some ways, you could actually trace it all the way back to the beginning of or at least the historical legacy of colonialism, as well as the laws that were adopted as part of industrial transformation in countries like UK, for example, the Poor Laws of the 1830s, the British Vagrancy Act of 1824, for example, which have left their imprint on many countries around the world because of colonialism. These laws provided the legal basis to imprison homeless persons, the so-called, quote, idle and disorderly persons, or, quote, rogues and vagabonds, or incorrigible rogues, or other such terms, and subject them to forced labor or intern them in many so-called workhouses. And we have seen that while in some countries, vagrancy laws have been rendered ruled unconstitutional. For example, in the US, for example, Supreme Court rendered rulings that found that vagrancy laws were unconstitutionally vague, and this was in the early 70s. But even though that was done, unfortunately, in the US, there is a persistence of a criminalization of homelessness by adopting laws that don't focus on the status of persons. For example, people are not criminalized by simply calling them as idle persons or rogues or vagabonds or vagrants, etc. But instead, the laws actually focus on conduct, what they actually do. So the laws increasingly focus on what they do. For example, sleeping outside or eating outside or performing any other bodily functions in the public is criminalized. So there is an indirect way in which homeless persons are targeted, because very often you find that the only people who engage in these kinds of tasks, for example, eating or sleeping outside, are actually engaged in by persons who are actually homeless. So by criminalizing those actions, in fact, in countries like the US, there is an indirect way in which homeless persons continue to be criminalized. In fact, that's kind of the issue that came up before the US Supreme Court in April of this year in the Grants Pass case. That was a case that actually tested the constitutionality of a local regulation in the city of Grants Pass in Oregon, in the United States, which sought to criminalize people who were sleeping outside. So the argument was that it was not criminalizing homeless persons, but it was simply criminalizing conduct, meaning anybody who sleeps outside. Unfortunately, the US Supreme Court found that such local regulations were not unconstitutional, that it was okay to adopt such regulations. Now, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and myself, we filed an amicus petition in that case, arguing that such laws are simply an indirect way to criminalize homeless persons. And they also, in the absence of any adequate shelter beds, and in the absence of other safe and dignified accommodations available, they also constitute cruel and unusual punishment, which is a violation of the 8th Amendment of the US Constitution, but also of the prohibition of torture and cruel and inhuman, degrading treatment and punishment under international human rights law. Now, unfortunately, since the passage of this ruling in April, I have received a number of complaints from around the US of cities which have actually ramped up their criminalization of homeless persons. In other words, things have been made worse, far worse, since April, and I'm compiling all this information now to consider any further interventions that I can make. So I pointed to the example of the US just to show that even in the richest, most so-called advanced countries in the world, all kinds of underhanded efforts are being adopted to criminalize homelessness. And I think, as was pointed out recently, the Danish Supreme Court judgment, I think, was pointed out recently. I believe it was a 2022 judgment that sentenced a Lithuanian citizen to 60 days of unconditional imprisonment for begging. Since, in fact, 2017, changes in the Danish Penal Code have contributed to increasing criminalization of the presence of homeless persons in public spaces. So, prima facie, what I feel is also that there is a strongly xenophobic element to laws like these. In debates introducing the new sanctions in Denmark, it was openly stated that the aim of these policies is to target non-Danish citizens living homeless on the streets of Denmark. So the figures, in fact, confirm this. From 94 convictions under paragraph 197 of the Danish Penal Code, 91 were of non-Danes. So it's simply another way of engaging in a kind of a racial targeting of people who are non-Danish citizens. All this is extremely concerning to me. That's the reason why we issued this report in June of this year. And we hope that in the coming weeks and months, we can actually engage in collective work with all of you and with civil society groups around the world to promote policies that are more humane, that are less costly, that are less discriminatory, that also address the root causes of why homelessness happens in the first place. Surely governments can do better, and we must hold them to a higher standard. So let me just end on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rajagopal, for that intervention. It was very interesting and necessary and timely, I think, at this moment. Okay, so we have time for questions and answers. So let me say, if you want to ask a question, maybe you could raise your hand if you're comfortable to turn your camera on, and I'll call on you. Or if you prefer, you can also put it in the chat box. I can read the question on your behalf, for Professor Rajagopal and also for my colleague María from Housing Rights Watch. Questions or responses or interventions, or as you wish. There is one question already that somebody sent in a message, so I'm going to read it out. I think it's kind of a question, kind of a response to what we've just heard. It says, from Jay, isn't part of the capitalist logic that homelessness is a necessary threat to hold over the working class so we continue to work? It would seem that any national and international social and political efforts to end homelessness will continue to fight uphill against corporate profit maximization. Any responses from this from our speakers?
Raj, would you like to say something about this?
I mean, I'm referred to the poor laws which are adopted in UK in the context of the shift of rural labor or rural residents largely to urban areas in order to convert people who are actually connected with the land to transform them into a productive workforce. And the whole objective was that you had to cut the ties that the so-called rural people had with their land. So they become free-floating labor. And only then can you actually have access to an adequate or a pool of labor that was available for industrialization. And this ideology is very much at the core of economic development theories. If you actually fast forward to the beginning of the development era, especially after most of the formerly colonized countries became independent after the 1940s and 1950s, development theory, was formulated as a way to sort of propose ways in which those countries can catch up with the rest of the world, and economic development strategies were formulated based on that. And if you look at one of the dominant sort of theories in that framework, an economist by the name of Arthur Lewis from the island of St. Lucia, Arthur Lewis actually put forward this whole theory about economic development under conditions of what he called unlimited supply of labor. Now, what does it mean to say unlimited supply of labor? I mean, surely humans are not unlimited. Nobody can be unlimited in a physical sense. But what he actually meant was the increasing ability to free people from their rural and or what he call unproductive engagements to make them into productive employees. So the ideology has remained with us, and most developing countries have also followed the same approach to, for example, first cut the ties that people have with their land in the rural areas, and secondly, to discourage the mobilization of the newly formed urban proletariat to be able to mobilize together by weakening, say, their ability to unionize and to come together as political actors, and to basically fragment the power of the working class so they can actually sort of be at the mercy of the capitalist class. So because the labor costs increase if they have the ability to come together, because they can demand better wages, for example. The whole idea is to actually keep them fragmented. And this is, in fact, the strategy that we see around the world. And unfortunately, this ideology that came from the history of British industrial transformation from the 1830s has not gone away. And we still see it pursued by different countries around the world. So, yes, unfortunately, I agree with that remark.
Thank you, Professor. I see a hand raised from Dr. Ufong. If you want to go ahead and unmute.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor. It's good to see you again. We met briefly in February at the CSOC in New York during the UN meeting. So, I come from Africa, and I've always said, that homelessness plays out slightly different in Africa because, the way housing is organized in the global north is slightly different from the way housing is organized in Africa. What am I trying to say? In Africa, individuals are supposed to build their own homes. So my question here is this. For us, for most communities in Africa, the issue of land rights comes, quite important. And as somebody, who has been associated with them, I was part of the expert group meeting, that worked on the UN CSOC 58 session, when that issue of homelessness came up. And I have been advocating at the UN that the issue of land rights should also be included as a major driver of homelessness in Africa. So, and I'm so happy, with your presentation, but I would also like you, if it's possible, let us also include these land rights, because as far as we are concerned, as long as communities exclude women from having right to land, women are often left out on the streets. Once there's a misunderstanding between them and their spouse or their family, they don't have a house. They neither inherit land nor do they inherit property because they are women. So I just wanted, to highlight this and also to see, how would you, advise us, to go about this, knowing fully well that homelessness plays out slightly different from what obtains in the global north and global south, particularly Africa. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Ofang, thank you for that. I think it's an extremely important intervention. And I would say it's not just Africa, in fact, everywhere, including in urban areas, the societies that are largely urban. For example, if you take Austria and you look at the classic example of Vienna, which is often touted as a great example of a city that is able to ensure affordable housing, for example. If you look at the Viennese model, which has been quite well studied by scholars, the basic difference between the Vienna model and many other cities in Europe is that the use of land governance instruments that go beyond reliance on exclusive market mechanisms to more publicly managed land management mechanisms. I say public, but not state. It could be state managed as well, like such as in Singapore, where over 80% of the people live in public housing, for example. They don't outright own their housing, but they live in houses with long-term leases. And this is in one of the most hyper-capitalistic countries in the world. So it's clearly not inconsistent to have, for example, state-managed ownership of land coexist with the capitalistic system. Private property rights in land, in other words, doesn't need to be the main sort of indicator of whether a country is capitalist or not. Singapore, surely nobody can say it's not capitalist. But we also see the Viennese model. And so I would just say that it's not just rural areas, but in urban areas too. Increasingly, what we find is that if we actually think that homelessness is actually clearly connected to the increasing failure in modern life to ensure access to affordable housing, that people are one paycheck away from being evicted because some landlord manages to raise the rent and there is no way you can push back against it, you're out on the street, which is what is happening in most of the G20 countries, then the way to actually ensure affordable housing is to have control over the most costly sort of input into the cost of housing. And what is that? It is land. Land contributes 70% of the housing cost. So you have to have control over land price. If you are in the situation as, say, San Diego is, as I said, where 80% of the land is zoned for single family home use, in other words, it's part of the private market, you're never going to be able to produce enough affordable housing. In other words, homelessness will always be a permanent condition in the city of San Diego. It's never going to change unless you address this issue. So that's basically what I'm saying, that land is critical, almost central to this issue. And in fact, if I can just say that my next year's report to the General Assembly, meaning October of next year, is in fact going to be on the connection between housing and land. Land, this has been addressed here and there by the mandate, but it's never been subjected to a single report by the UN housing mandate so far. So I hope to do some contribution in that regard. And we also clearly need to have a better human rights-based understanding of something called land. Because, I mean, the human rights framework, as you know, Universal Declaration of Human Rights protects property rights. But the treaties, the ICCPR, the ICACR, do not actually protect property rights. They protect the right to housing. So property rights are always in a kind of an unsure status when it comes to the legal protection of the right to housing. And then there is the increasing sort of embrace of the concept of land rights. But what are exactly land rights? How are they different from, say, property rights or housing rights? Now, this issue is still being sort of sorted out, including through General Comment number 22, recently issued by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is a very important development. But I believe that we are at that moment when we have to really think of land in a way that goes beyond the notion of property rights, that anchors it more firmly to other human rights, including especially the right to adequate housing. And that's what I hope to do next year.
Thank you both for those interventions and for bringing that perspective that's not only a Western perspective, but certainly much broader. I think that was very necessary. We have a couple of comments in the chat box from Clémence. There's just a note that Prison Insider has published a series of articles on access to housing for people released from prison, highlighting vicious cycles between poverty, homelessness, and imprisonment. Clémence has put a link there. It's available in French and Spanish at the moment, and they are translating it into English shortly. Then another comment from Mikkel from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. The question is on the interlinkage, if any, between decisions of the European Court of Human Rights, for example, on criminalization of begging, and the interpretation of obligations under UN conventions such as the IESCR. The reason for the question is that the European Court of Human Rights in Dian versus Denmark found that the rules on prohibition of begging in Denmark were in compliance with Article 8 and 10, the ECHR. So I believe the question is about the interlinkage between the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights and the UN conventions. I'm picking up on Dian versus Denmark, which I know you mentioned earlier, Professor, if you have a comment on this.
Yes, I think it's a very important issue because it's not just this decision, but there are other ongoing litigation before not just the European Court of Human Rights, but also the European Court of Justice In fact, in a case involving this legislation that Denmark had targeting the so-called non-Western neighborhoods for demolition in Denmark, which was challenged before the Danish Supreme Court by litigants, and I joined that case also as in an amicus petition along with the special rapporteur on racism, and that case was referred to the European Court of Justice, now being litigated. And the oral arguments finished just a month ago, I believe, in that case. So the decision is expected. The issue is, well, in that case was European instruments such as the Equality Directive, for example, in the European context, and its relationship with the international human rights law, including the UN instruments. And what we have suggested in that case is that there is already established jurisprudence in European law that shows that there is indeed a practice to read European law to be consistent with international human rights standards. International law is the broader framework which the other regional systems, whether it's European, African, or Latin American, seek to harmonize their norms and practices with. So I hope that that continues to evolve in that direction, which also means that the particular sort of interpretations that are taken by the European Court of Justice or European Court of Human Rights have to be sort of tested against the standards and the normative sort of instruments that we have in the international system at the UN level as well.
Thank you very much for that. So I'm not seeing any other questions. I'll give a moment if anybody else wants to raise a hand or drop a question in the chat. If not, I'm just going to thank the UN Special Rapporteur for Adequate Housing, Professor Rajagopal, for being with us here today and giving up your time and giving us your insights and your expertise. I think it was a really interesting conversation. Also to my colleague María from Housing Rights Watch for her intervention and helping in the coordination. And just a final note, we have in the chat box our EPOC practice links where you can keep up to date with our activities. You can find the joint survey by the UN Special Rapporteur, as well as the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, which has been released in multiple different languages to read hereafter, as well as the links to Housing Rights Watch's activities. So thank you very much to everybody for being here today. It was a really interesting conversation. The recording will be available on YouTube, so you can share it or look back on it if you wish. And we look forward to seeing you all again at our next webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Awesome.